how have you become, or how has the ABC become the #1 online news website? What pathway did you take to achieve that?
We went through, as an industry, I think, a really interesting period about 5 or 6 years ago when the rise of clickbait really challenged the fundamentals of all news and information businesses and operations. And I think at that point there was a fork in the road. You could either go down the clickbait path and pursue, what at the time seemed like a kind of throughput advertising model that required lots of traffic going very quickly, or you could pursue a model that said, where is the real value in news and information and in things that people are going to hold valuable for a longer period of time? Now, obviously, we didn't have a business model at the ABC that required us to chase advertising. So I remember saying to our team at the time, if everybody else in the clickbait world is going to go and swim in the shallow end of the pool, let's stay down the deep end, and we might just find that that's a successful model for us. What you've seen since then, as clickbait has died, is people returning to what is fundamentally valuable about journalism, and subscription-based services emerging as the much more successful business models in journalism. So luckily, we sort of went down that path. We decided to bank on the things that we could do better than anybody else at the ABC: in-depth journalism, investigative journalism, really good fact-based analysis, long-form international reporting, data journalism, those sorts of things that we thought we could really add value to. And in the end, that has provided us with a pathway to being the #1 digital service in Australia.
So you've gone that way, and the New York Times is very interesting too for people who follow closely enough to see how they've struggled with working out where the future of journalism is, because they've tried many things, most of which have failed, but there have been also some pretty terrific successes. So is that your approach, to recognise that journalism is very much disrupted and you have to find new ways of doing things to reach the same audience in different ways, but also new audiences?
I think the thing to remember, and when you look at the good business models that have emerged in journalism during these times, the New York Times, you could argue the Australian, you could argue the Financial Review in this country, things, built good subscription-based business models. Fundamentally, things that are valuable are still valued by audiences, and that is what emerges as a good, solid business model.
Yes, but change is hard, and journalists are no different. They will simply try and do what they used to do better. So what kind of conversations did you have at programs like Four Corners and 7:30 to sell them on the idea of doing something different?
Well, I think we came to a real pivot point where we had a choice. And the choice to succeed in digital was either to recognise that our broadcast programs and channels were going to decline in audience over time, and we could have turned them off much more rapidly and moved resources and effort over to starting new digital things. Or we could recognise that, sure, radio and television viewing habits are going to go down over time, but if fundamentally the program teams and the journalists that work on those platforms produce stuff that we can make valuable to digital audiences, we should keep doing the valuable stuff for broadcast, but just open up new pathways for digital audiences to enjoy it. So I called it equal digital life. And effectively it was to say, if we're going to do a story, it's got to have equal value to digital audiences as it does to our broadcast audiences. And how do we think through what that means? And by doing that, we opened up a whole new pathway to demographics that were never going to watch television or listen to radio. So what we see in our audience profile now is still a very successful television and radio audiences for those brands, but a completely different demographic coming to the same stories on digital platforms in ways that they couldn't imagine, and maybe some of our program makers couldn't have imagined 5 or 6 years ago. And that really has what's driven the success of ABC News on digital platforms.
So if that was 5 or 6 years ago, and you being very much one of the leaders on strategy inside the ABC, where are you going to be in 5, 6, 10 years from now?
So I think the next big change that's coming, and I think as foreboding as this is, I think it's potentially as big, if not bigger, than the digital change we've already been through, is one around the habits of our audiences. And I've sort of loosely called it the end of schedule. And if you think about television viewing or radio listening, we're already there. Netflix and Spotify are examples of these sorts of things. What does that look like in a news and information context? Clearly, there's some digital platforms out there already serving that need. But I think as journalists and as content makers for contemporary audiences, we totally have to grasp personalized and on-demand experiences for audiences. And that will be the next wave of change, the end of schedule.
Outside the journalist community, and say in the business community or in the political community or in the general community, accuracy of journalism is a continual conversation. It's the same conversation that people have about Facebook and Twitter as well, that they're rogue channels for misinformation. How do you, in that context that you've just been describing, create a situation where trust in journalism goes up? Because that has to be an essential differentiation, doesn't it?
It does. And look, things are playing out well for good journalism organisations in this way. And what journalists do is trade and trust. And good journalists absolutely seek the truth in the way they go about their job. And I actually think that has become more and more valuable as a commodity as more and more sources have been available to people.
But you'd also know that the reputation of a lot of journalists is that they take shortcuts, don't follow the code, don't corroborate information, don't ring people to check facts, those kinds of things in the rush to publish. So how do you change that?
Well, that's difficult because what you're seeing now is fewer journalism resources. And if you're talking about a fully on-demand experience, endless deadlines. So I think the best we can do in that situation is use technology well, is use whatever tools we've got well, and I think is to reflect on the fact that we are not going to be able to do the volume that we once did in some of the things that we have, that traditional audiences have wanted of us. So certainly one of the conversations we've had with our local newsrooms is you've got to dramatically reduce the number of stories you do. And what we've got to think about is what are the stories that we can do that are most valuable, that we can make the most difference with, and how do we retain the quality around the storytelling and the journalism for those.
Does that mean that we lose out on information?
Well, it does, but I think what you will see move into those spaces then, whether we like it or not, frankly, is other sources of information that then emerge. So what will emerge in those spaces, I think, are new forms of journalism, digital startups, community-based journalism organisations, those sorts of things.
So you've talked about where you see the next leap in journalism. Have you got a vision for the future of journalism?
So I think the vision for the future of journalism is going right back to the basics of what journalism is for me. It's not about which television programs you have on at what time slots, or what radio programs, or how long that news bulletin is, or what the demographics are. It's fundamentally going back and saying, what is the basic commodity that people really need out of journalism? It's great storytelling. It's telling me something I don't already know. It's narratives, it's brilliant pictures, it's great audio. These are the fundamental elements that will always succeed, I think, for audiences, no matter what the platforms are, or no matter how people get their news and information. So I keep thinking the future of journalism is fundamentally about what journalism has always been. And if we complicate it too much more than that, I think you then get stuck in a platform-driven world where you're making decisions around what we think TikTok might want today, whereas in 5 years' time, it'll be a completely different platform, still looking fundamentally for valuable things.
Gaven Morris, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben.